Hello everyone. This is Azren, the language nerd here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, and welcome to today's YouTube video and, of course, podcast episode. Today, I'm continuing my series on my top language learning tips. If you haven't seen the other episodes in this series, I'm going to put a link in the description box of this episode so you can go check those out. Essentially, what I'm doing is I'm condensing the thousands of pieces of content I've made since 2016 onto one single web page. So I can distill all that knowledge and language learners can consume a very small number of videos / podcasts and learn the most important things that they need to know that they can start to use right away on their language learning journey. Today, what I'd like to talk about is some advice on selecting the best resources for you. Depending on the language you're learning, it is probable that you faced one of two problems. Problem one is that you don't know what resources to choose because there are so many choices. Maybe there are 25 different apps and lots of YouTube channels, and there are classes and textbooks and so many choices that you don't know which resources to use. Or you might have the opposite problem where you're learning a language that doesn't have that many resources for those that are wanting to learn it. And so it's an opposite problem, and there's different advice that applies to each problem. Let's start with what to do if there aren't that many resources, because that's something I can address relatively quickly. If you're learning a language that doesn't have very many resources, you have to make the most of what resources there are. If there are only 6 resources to learn that language, you have to make the most of those 6 resources. Certain languages, let's take French, for example, have lots of resources. And for those languages, if you start using a resource and you don't make the most of it, it's not the end of the world because you could switch to another resource. If you're learning a language that isn't like French and there are only 7 resources or relatively few resources to learn a language, you don't have that luxury anymore. So you have to make the most of the resources that you find. Now, the next thing, if you're learning a language that has relatively few resources, is you have to spend more time looking for resources. You have to Google for longer to find resources. You have to look through the App Store for Apple devices, or the Google Play Store for Android devices. You have to look in bookstores. You have to ask other learners that you meet. You have to look in Facebook groups. You have to try and find maybe even LinkedIn groups. You have to look for forums. You have to spend much more time looking for resources. When I was learning, and I'm continuing to learn Gujarati, a language from India, well, I've had to do that myself. There are very few resources to learn this language. And so I spent, I don't even know how many hours, at least hundreds of hours, I would say, just on trying to find resources. And when I meet other people learning the language, they can often put me on to resources that I didn't know existed. Sometimes people pointed out resources you can find on Amazon. Or sometimes actually found this out when I was in India. You can go to bookstores, and in India that don't ship to other countries, there are just these one-off individual independent bookstores that they have certain books that you can find by going to India. And so you have to be constantly on the lookout for resources because they probably, in some way, they do exist, hopefully, fingers crossed, but they might just be hiding, or rather because you're looking for a needle in a haystack. The last thing I'll say, if there are relatively few resources, is that I recommend you find as many native speakers as you can, or fluent speakers as you can, and ask them lots of questions. You know, is this correct? Is that correct? Is that correct? Or is this correct? And you're trying to figure out how the language works, how to pronounce this, how the grammar works, etc., etc. That's something I've had to do for Gujarati. I'm currently doing an indigenous language revitalization project, and have been for about 2 years, for a language called Blackfoot here, which is spoken. It's an indigenous language in southern Alberta and northern Montana. And over the past couple of years, as I've interacted primarily with 2 different people who have learned Blackfoot. And the 2 people that I've interacted with, both of them have even told me that as they've learned this language that has relatively few resources, Well, one thing they've had to do is just ask lots of questions to elders and other fluent speakers that they've met over the years. Now, changing gears, if you're learning a language that has quite a few resources and you don't know how to select the right ones, well, you've got the opposite problem. Thankfully, it's a relatively straightforward problem to solve. The first thing you have to realize, which is, I suppose, common sense, is that you have to let go or at least understand the fact that there is not necessarily the best resource. You don't have to find the perfect resource. In fact, there isn't the perfect resource. You might like one resource and person B doesn't like it. For example, person A might be learning a language by using whatever 3 resources. You try those 3 and it doesn't work for you. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is the only real way, at least the way I view it, one of the best ways to figure out if the resources you're using are the right ones or not, is to see if they're working. Are they working? And the best way to know ultimately if they're working is if you are getting better. Are you improving? That's the number one thing to look at. Are you getting better? If you're getting better, well then great. The resources you're using are working, right? That's the only way to get over that, because we know that there are lots of different resources. There are lots of ways to approach learning a language. There are a number of ways you can get to the finish line of fluency, quote unquote, right? Because there are lots of pathways to follow, the only way to know if you're on the right path is to check periodically if you're on the right path, if you're actually moving up the mountain, if you're actually getting better. So how do you check if you're on the right path? That's a good question, no? Well, there's two ways that I really like. There's 2 ways that I really like. The first one is to get a level assessment done. I would say every 6 to 12 months. Doesn't need to be more often than that for most people. Every 6 to 12 months is just fine. If you're going to get a level assessment, you want to do that with either a private instructor who has a set process that they use for doing level assessments. And that way it's a standardized level assessment each time with the same person or the same organization. And you can see objectively based on their assessment if you're getting better. That's one option. Another form of getting a level assessment, depending on the language that you're learning, is you can actually take a standardized exam. So a language like French has an exam called the DELF exam. And this is a widely taken exam by French students. It's a certificate that's recognized. That is I guess an accredited certificate. I'm not sure what the right wording would be, but people know what the DELF exam is. It's widely known, and so it's widely recognized. So if you take that exam, it's a standardized official way to demonstrate, yes, this is your level. Congratulations, you passed. Here's your certificate. And so you could, depending on the language, of course, not every language has that type of exam, but that would be an option to consider if the language you're learning offers that kind of exam, if someone offers something like that. So that's one option, right? You can do a full level assessment either with a private instructor who has their own process for doing level assessments, or you can go take a standardized exam where you get a certificate that's actually recognized, widely recognized. The other way you can do a level assessment, or rather see if the methods you're using are working, is to go back to old content. Go back to old content that you used to struggle with in the language you're learning. This could be, for instance, old textbooks you used to use. This could be old podcasts you used to listen to, old songs you used to listen to try and learn from. It could be looking back through old notes, in notes that you wrote in a notebook. It could be, there's a number of ways to do it. It depends on how you're learning a language, I suppose. But going back to old content that you used to use to learn the language. So when I say old content, I would say go back at least 12 months. This is not the time to look at your notes from 3 months ago, not necessarily, because sometimes something you learned 3 months ago, your brain is still processing, your brain is still digesting. So 3 months ago is not good. Even 6 months ago, potentially, it's not enough time, depending on a number of factors. But I think at least 12 months or longer ago, looking through that content and seeing, hey, what do you think of that content now that it's been more than 12 months. And that's another way to see if what you've been doing has worked. I'll give you a couple personal examples. So I've gone back to I listen to a lot of music. So I'll go back to old songs I used to listen to. And it's really cool because often I'll see that, wow, it's been 18 months since I listened to the song, for example. I actually forgot it existed. And now I'm listening to it again. And I understand half of it. Whereas before, I didn't understand a word of what they said. Or sometimes I've gone through my old textbooks and I'll look through the textbooks and I'll realize, oh my God, this textbook is now so easy for me. Wow, that's crazy. It's crazy that that's easy for me now. Or sometimes I've gone back and watched old shows or YouTube videos that I used to find very difficult. And now they're just not. I have take standardized exams and things like that as well. And so those are two very straightforward ways that everybody watching this or listening to this can do to figure out if they are indeed getting better. And if you find you are getting better, then yay, hallelujah, the resources you're using, they're working for you. And that means you can keep staying on the path you're on. But if you find that you haven't really improved after a 6 to 12 month window, well, that's an indication to you that you probably should be switching things up. The last thing I'll say on finding the right resources is actually spend like an hour or two on YouTube and Google and just researching on the internet what kinds of resources exist and looking at reviews. On YouTube, people will make reviews of different resources they've used, why they like them, why they don't. And do that for, like, actually watch 5 or 10 reviews about language learning resources to see where the overlaps are. So if you see that 10 people are all, how do I say this? All of them say the same pros about one app and they all have the same cons about one app, you found something that approximates the truth about that app, for example. Whereas if one person says, oh, this is a great app, or that's not a good app, or oh, this app's not good for this, or that program's not good because of that, well, that's just subjective opinion. But if 25 people all say the same thing, it still might be subjective opinion, but you're probably closer to the truth. And that's an opinion. Now that's a piece of information that holds more value or holds more weight. Does that make sense? So spending an hour or two actually consuming YouTube videos, blog posts, Reddit comments, reviews on Amazon if you're looking for a book, for example, and actually consuming what other people have said, that's something that I think is also a very beneficial practice. Okay, hope you guys found this video/podcast helpful. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me by visiting azrenthelanguagenerd.com/contact. That's AZ or ZREN, thelanguagenerd.com/contact. I also recommend you go into the description box of this episode to see the webpage on my website where I've made all the other episodes for this Azren's Top Language Learning Tips series. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll chat very soon. Bye-bye.